Hello friends, welcome to lesson 2, growth of industrialization, industrial revolution and its impact on society. Introduction. We all are aware that the period between 1760 and 1840 is generally described as the period of industrial revolution. The term was coined by French economist Jerome Adolphe Blanqui in 1837, but the credit for the term must be given to Arnold Toynbee, the English historian and philosopher. It was his lectures on the Industrial Revolution 1884 that firmly affixed the words Industrial Revolution to the events in the British social and economic experience of those years. Objectives. After completion of this lesson, you will be able to analyze the growth of industrialization. You will be able to understand about industrial revolution and you will be able to discuss the impact of industrial revolution on society. So, let us begin our discussion with regard to industrialization. It is the process of formation of industries in most simplest sense. Early industrialization occurred in Europe and North America during 18th and 19th centuries and later in other parts of the world. Numerous strategies for industrialization have been pursued in different countries over time with varying levels of success and diversified experiences. Industrialization is the process by which an economy is transformed from a primarily agricultural one to one based on manufacturing of goods. Individual manual labor is often replaced by the mechanized mass production and craftsmen are replaced by assembly lines. Industrialization is characterized by economic growth, efficient division of labor and greater use of technological innovation to solve problems as opposed to dependency on conditions outside of human control. Industrialization also occurred in United States between 1880s and the Great Depression between 1929 to 1939. The onset of the Second World War also led to a great deal of industrialization, which resulted in the growth and development of large urban centers and suburbs. Industrialization is an outgrowth of capitalism and its effects on society are still undetermined to some extent. However, it has resulted in a lower birth rate and a higher average income. In India, especially during colonial rule, industrialization had a significant pace to meet the needs of the British industries and it was a source of raw material for industries based in England. In post-independent India, second 5-year plan laid down a strong foundation for industrialization. The economic reforms initiated through liberalization, privatization and globalization have opened greater avenues for industrialization and accelerated the expansion of service-based industries. Friends, let us now discuss about industrial revolution. Industrial revolution refers to the greatly increased output of machine-made goods that began in England during the 18th century. Historians conventionally divide the industrial revolution into two approximately consecutive parts. What is called the first industrial revolution lasted from mid 18th century to about 1830 and was mostly confined to Britain. The second industrial revolution lasted from mid 19th century until the early 20th century and took place in Britain, continental Europe, North America and Japan. Later in the 20th century, the second industrial revolution spread to the other parts of the world. Before industrial revolution, people wove textiles by hand. Beginning in the middle 1700s, machines did this and other jobs as well. The Industrial Revolution started in England and soon spread to continental Europe and North America, which brought economic changes which took place in the 18th and 19th centuries and completely transformed the European society. With regard to production, Industrial Revolution brought about two main changes. What are they? Firstly, it replaced the domestic system by factory system and small scale production by the mass production. This was the second impact. Prior to the proliferation of industrial manufacturing facilities, fabrication and processing were generally carried out by hand in people's homes. The steam engine was a key invention as it allowed for many different types of machinery. The growth of the metals and textile industries allowed for the mass production of basic personal and commercial goods. As manufacturing activities grew, transportation and finance and communication industries expanded to support the new production capacities. Industrial Revolution led to unprecedented expansion in wealth and financial well-being for some people. It also led to increased labor specialization and allowed cities to support larger populations, motivating a rapid demographic shift. People left rural areas in large numbers, seeking potential fortunes in budding industries. The revolution quickly spread beyond Britain, with manufacturing centers being established in continental Europe and the United States. When we talk about the later periods of industrialization, World War II created an unprecedented demand for certain manufactured goods, leading to a buildup of productive capacity. After the war, reconstruction in Europe occurred alongside a massive population expansion in North America. This provided further growth of industrial activity. Innovation, specialization and wealth creation were the causes and effects of industrialization in this period. The late 20th century was noteworthy for rapid industrialization in other parts of the world, notably East Asia. The Asian tigers, comprising of Hong Kong, South Korea, Taiwan and Singapore, are well known for the economic growth that altered their countries as well as districts. China famously experienced its own industrial revolution after moving towards a more mixed economy and away from heavy central planning. When we try to understand different modes of industrialization, there are different strategies and methods of industrialization which have been followed at different times and places with varying degrees of success. The Industrial Revolution in Europe and United States initially took place under generally mercantilistic policies that fostered the early growth of industry, but were later associated with more laissez-faire or free market approach that opened markets to foreign trade as an outlet for industrial output. In the post-Second World War era, developing nations across Latin America and Africa adopted a strategy of import substituting industrialization, which involved protectionist barriers to trade coupled with direct subsidization or nationalization of domestic industries. Nearly at the same time, parts of Europe and several East Asian economies pursued an alternative strategy of export-led growth. This strategy emphasized the deliberate pursuit of foreign trade to build exporting industries and partly dependent on maintaining a weak currency to make exports more attractive to foreign buyers. In general, the export-led growth has outdone import substituting industrialization. Lastly, socialist nations of the 20th century repeatedly embarked on various deliberate, centrally planned programs of industrialization almost entirely independent of either domestic or foreign trade markets. These include the first and second 5-year plans in the Soviet Union and the Great Leap Forward in China. While these efforts did reorient the respective economies toward a more industrial base and an increase in output of the industrial commodities, they were also accompanied by harsh government repression, deteriorating living and working conditions for workers, and even widespread starvation. Let us now try to discuss about the impact of industrial revolution. We all are aware that industrial revolution had massive socio-economic and psycho-cultural impact. These changes included wider distribution of wealth and increased international trade. Managerial hierarchies also developed to supervise the division of labor. By the late 1700s, many people could no longer earn their living in the countryside. Increasingly, people moved from farms and villages into bigger towns and cities to find work in factories. Cities grew larger, but they were often dirty, crowded, and unhealthy. Machines greatly increased production. This meant that products were cheaper to make and also cheaper to buy. Many factory owners became rich. Although the machines made work easier in some ways, factory work created many problems for the laborers. Factory employees did not earn much and the work was often dangerous. Many worked 14 to 16 hours per day, 6 days per week. Men, women and even small children worked in factories. The Industrial Revolution transformed economies that had been based on agriculture and handicrafts into economies based on large-scale industry, mechanized manufacturing and the factory system. New machines, new power sources and new ways of organizing work made existing industries more productive and efficient. New industries also arose, including in the late 19th century, the automobile industry. Industrial Revolution led to the rise of industrial capitalism and finance capitalism. Before Industrial Revolution, goods were produced at home with the help of simple and cheap tools which did not need much capital. But with installation of big machines, huge funds were needed and a class of capitalists made its appearance. However, with the passage of time, the industrial operations grew still more complex and enormous funds were needed which could not be provided by the capitalists from their individual resources. Therefore, they began to look towards investment bankers for these funds. This ushered in the era of finance capital. Though Industrial Revolution was majorly an economic phenomenon, it greatly affected the social and political life of society. With regard to the social impacts, the Industrial Revolution increased the overall amount of wealth and distributed it more widely than had been the case in earlier centuries, helping to enlarge the middle class. However, the replacement of the domestic system of industrial production, in which independent craftsperson worked in or near their homes, with factory system and mass production, consigned large numbers of people, including women and children, to long hours of tedious and often dangerous work at subsistence wages. Their miserable conditions gave rise to trade union movement in the mid 19th century. In the special sphere also, the Industrial Revolution produced far-reaching consequences. In the first place, the growth of factory system resulted in growth of new cities. Workers shifted to places near the factories where they were employed, and this resulted in the growth of number of new cities like Leeds, Manchester, Birmingham and Sheffield in Britain, which soon became the centers of industry, trade and commerce. On the contrary, the rise of cities was accompanied by growth of slums. With the emergence of new factories and growth in population, the problem assumed more serious dimensions. The factory owners were mainly interested in amassing great fortunes and hardly paid any attention to the welfare and well-being of their workers. In the dark, dingy and dirty houses, the workers fell easy prey to various types of diseases and often died premature deaths. The extremely low wages paid by the factory owners made it difficult for them to make both ends meet. As a consequence, they were often obliged to send their women and children to factories where they worked on extremely low wages. The industrialists preferred women and children also because they were easy to manage. The conditions of factory life were not conducive to healthy family life. The women were required to work in factories and mines for long hours and were hardly left with any time or energy to look after their household or children. Industrial Revolution led to sharp divisions in society. A new system of society called capitalism arose in its place. It was an economic system in which the means of production and distribution were privately owned and operated for profit. This system gave rise to two new social classes, bourgeoisie and proletariat. Bourgeoisie was the class that of factory owners who owned the factories and employed and paid wages to factory workers. They also controlled the sale of goods and their main aim was to make maximum profits. They controlled the capital or the money and hence were called capitalists. They amassed great wealth and paid very low wages to the workers. They were a prosperous group of people and led luxurious lives. On the other hand, the proletariats was the class which comprised of workers who worked in factories. They lived in great hardship and were exploited by the factory owners. With the passage of time, capitalist classes went on improving and that of the working classes went on deteriorating. This caused great social disharmony and gave rise to sharp conflicts between the capitalists and the workers. When we try to discuss the political impact, in the political sphere also, the Industrial Revolution had a many-fold consequence. It led to colonization of Asia and Africa. Great Britain and other industrial countries of Europe began to look for new colonies which could supply them the necessary raw materials for feeding their industries and also serve as ready market for their finished industrial products. Therefore, the industrial countries carved out extensive colonial empires in the 19th century. India was also one of the colonies. It is well known that colonialism produced adverse effects on the local people and resulted in their ruthless exploitation. However, it cannot be denied that it also paved the way for industrialization of these territories because the European colonizers set up certain industries in these areas. Industrial revolution sharply divided the countries as well. The industrially advanced countries which possessed necessary finances and technical know-how invested their surplus capital in the backward countries and fully exploited their resources and crippled their industries. Thus, the world came to be divided into two groups, the developed and the underdeveloped world, which is a cause of great tension even in the contemporary times. As a result of industrial revolution, a large number of Europeans went across the oceans and settled down in America and Australia and contributed to Europeanization of these countries. Industrial revolution provided boost to the reform movement in England. A number of factory laws were enacted to improve the lot of the workers between 1833 to 1845, which tried to limit the working hours for children under 11 years of age to 9 hours a day and that of a woman to 12 hours a day. These acts also prohibited employment of children in mines and laid down general rules for the health and safety of the workers. A movement known as Chartist movement was launched to demand reforms for improving the lot of workers and for introduction of universal suffrage, secret voting, equal electoral districts, no property qualifications for membership, payment of members and annual elections. Though these demands did not receive favorable response from the government, but in the course of time these demands were conceded one by one. Industrial revolution led to a strong trade union movement. The working men in various trades and industries formed trade union to protect themselves against their employers. Though initially the English law forbade these unions, but ultimately they were accorded recognition by law in 1824. However, the trade unions could not prove effective as they were divided and lacked national unity. It was only towards the close of the 19th century that the General Federation of British Trade Union was established, which established friendly relations with the unions of other European countries. Thus, by the close of 19th century, the trade unions came to occupy important position in the political and economic structure of the society. Finally, Industrial Revolution paved the way for the development of new social and economic doctrines as well. Imperialism is the policy of extending political and economic control over a weak country by a powerful one. The phenomenon gained strength in the 19th century largely due to Industrial Revolution. A market for manufactured goods and sources for obtaining cheap raw materials for producing more goods were desperately needed. Areas to invest surplus capital were also required. This led the European nations to acquire colonies in the politically and militarily weak countries of Asia and Africa. These countries could easily be conquered by the powerful Europeans. They provided a good opportunity for the investment of surplus capital. Besides, Asia and Africa were well provided with natural resources and had a huge potential to absorb finished goods. Let us discuss about the impact of Industrial Revolution in terms of specific aspects like this. With regard to the size of cities, there was growth of factories, bringing job seekers to cities, urban areas doubling, tripling or quadrupling in size, factories developing near sources of energy, many new industrial cities specializing in certain industries. With regard to living conditions, there were no sanitary codes or building controls. There was lack of adequate housing, education and police protection. There was lack of running water and indoor plumbing. There were frequent epidemics sweeping through the slums. Eventually, better housing, healthier diets and cheaper clothing also emerged. With regard to working conditions, industrialization definitely created new jobs for the workers, and workers trying to keep pace with the machines were also encouraged. Factories were dirty and unsanitary. Workers running dangerous machines for long hours in unsafe conditions, harsh and severe factory discipline. Eventually, higher wages, shorter hours and better working conditions emerged. With regard to emergence of social classes, we witness that growing middle class of factory owners, shippers and merchants took place. Upper class of landowners and aristocrats were resentful of rich middle classes. Lower middle class of factory overseers and skilled workers were there. Workers overworked and were underpaid. In general, a rising standard of living with some groups excluded developed. There are several advantages and disadvantages of industrial revolution. With regard to the significant advantages of industrial revolution, we can include these aspects. Firstly, center of economic life shifted from villages to cities and towns where the factories were situated. Secondly, urban, that is cities, and rural, that is villages, life became dependent upon one another. Isolated life of self-sufficient villages came to an end. Thirdly, men became free to develop their capabilities in areas other than farming. Fourthly, it brought countries and people together. There was an international awareness among people because developments in one country influenced the other. Industrial revolution also led to the aristocracy and nobility with their feudal ideas were replaced by the newly rich middle class capitalists, that is bourgeoisie, who also became politically powerful. Industrial revolution led to better transport, communications and mechanized goods made life comfortable for men. The industrial revolution produced a number of other benefits as well. These included healthier diets, better housing, inexpensive mass produced clothing. Because the industrial revolution created a demand for engineers as well as clerical and professional workers, it expanded educational opportunities. The middle and upper classes prospered immediately from industrial revolution. For the workers it took longer, but their lives gradually improved during 1800s. Labor eventually won higher wages, shorter hours and better working conditions. Between 1700 and 1900, revolutions in agriculture, production, transportation and communication changed the lives of people in Western Europe and the United States. Industrialization also gave Europe tremendous economic power. The development of a middle class created great opportunities for education and democratic participation. Greater democratic participation in turn fueled a powerful movement for social reforms. On the contrary, the disadvantages of industrial revolution include cities becoming crowded, smoky with problems of slums, housing, sanitation, accidents and epidemics. Women and child labor was badly exploited. Workers suffered from long working hours, low wages and unemployment, unsafe conditions of work with no rights to vote, strike or form trade unions initially. Society became divided into rich and poor, the haves and the have-nots, and it led to wars of imperialism and colonization. Friends, let us now summarize this lesson. The long-term effects of industrial revolution are still evident. Most people today in the industrialized countries can afford consumer goods that would have been considered luxuries 50 or 100 years ago. Further, their living and working conditions are much improved over those of workers in the 19th century. Even today, the economic pressures of industrialization frequently lead to the overuse of natural resources and the abuse of the environment. The profits derived from industrialization, however, permit thoughtful governments to invest in urban improvements as well. Thank you.